Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this session. Let me see how this works. So, as indicated, I'm going to talk about one of the proof of concepts that we did for the City of Antwerp in Belgium. This proof of concept has been developed with a cross-border working team. So we have a blockchain team in the Netherlands, in Ghelen, in our innovation center, and they have been participating in this proof of concept as well. In addition to that, these concepts are also adopted in a solution that we are building for the United Nations, and that was recently shown at the Davos Congress in Switzerland. Now, before we start, so I arrived here this morning, and the first thing that they asked me after queuing was, can I get your identity card? So we have like this electronic ID card in Belgium. And I was quite reluctant to give that ID card to that person because I don't know the person. There's a lot of information about me on that card, and he only needs that for my name and to identify whether I'm the person that I claim to be. So it's kind of uncomfortable. I'm actually giving kind of value to that person at that moment. I'm giving my identity to that person. And when we talk about blockchain, we actually typically use a definition in which we tell blockchain, or actually distributed ledger technology, that is used. You see it as a distributed database in which you can only add information. The information is visible to all the parties, in theory, that participate in that ecosystem, that network. So the information is exchanged between the parties to keep them up to date, but we use encryption to ensure that the data is secure and that there is a link, that the data is secure and that you can secure the data only giving access to other people when you want to give access. Now, in that way, we can use distributed ledger or blockchain for any kind of value. And that value actually is my identity in this case. There are other types of value in which we also develop proof of concepts, but they are not applicable today in this case. In addition to this, by using smart contracts on top of blockchain, we actually take away the emphasis on the technical use of data. I gave my identity card this morning to that person, and the only thing was checking my name, but there is so much more information on my ID card, and there was nothing done with that. And that is actually what we do. We gather a lot of information, but we don't use all of that information because we don't know how to exploit it. That person only needed to know whether I was signed up or not. So if we would get the data out of a trusted source and if you would get the data out of a trusted source and the trusted source would just say, yes or no, he is in my database, that would solve the problem. Yes? So the functional use of data is much more important, and blockchain and smart contracts will enable you in doing that. And I will take you through a story in which we use those smart contracts. Now, that actually brings me to one big question. And that question is, who am I? Am I a physical person? Am I a person with an identity? But what about refugees, for example? Those are people as well. But who are they? There are different identities that we can have, and here you can see some of them. We can have identities on social media. We have public identities. We have an identity with banks. We have an identity with governments. And what you can see at the bottom right-hand side is the Belgium electronic ID card. So that is our official identity in Belgium. But what does it mean, my identity? Typically, we, as a citizen, we think that the government is there for us. Or we think that companies are interested in us. But I have a thing to think about for you. If you're not paying for the product, most probably you are the product yourself. Because companies, they need information. And they need information about who you are, about you as a customer, you as a citizen, to deliver their services to their customers, their end consumers. But I don't want that other people just own my identity. My information about myself, about my family, is available in maybe 100 different types of systems. But what do they do with it? The other side, my employer, does he really know that my information is correct and that my information is still relevant? If I move, I need to inform my utilities companies, my employer, my bank. If I don't do, then they don't have relevant information anymore. So that came, and that brought us to the proof of concept that we were building, which is called smart contracts for live events. In life, there are two things that are actually sure. The first one is everybody is born and everybody dies. Those are the two things that are sure in life. But in between, we marry, we get children, we move around, we get degrees, we go studying, etc., etc. And all of those informations are stored in different systems by the government, by banks, and by other companies. What we try to do here is actually to try to solve the question, can we give the power back to the citizens in managing who has access to what information within the regulatory framework? Now, let me start with a first story. This is Sophie, and Sophie is walking down on a market in Antwerp, and she's going for a drink. And when she's there for a drink, she actually downloads the app that we built on her smartphone. That's what you see here. And she registers in that app just her phone number and her mobile. At that moment, there is an identity which is created on the blockchain. And that's what you see here. So there's a certificate which is created on the blockchain. And that certificate is linked to the app on her mobile phone, on her mobile number. At that moment, Sophie is known. So the phone of Sophie is known on the blockchain, and this is the unique identity on the blockchain. But there is nothing in this vault. There are no other identities. There is no public identity, there is no bank identity, etc., etc. So that is what Sophie is doing now. She's going to register herself, her public identity, her Belgian identity, on blockchain in her vault. So what happens now is Sophie actually enters her social security number, and the government needs to approve that Sophie is actually the person who she claims to be. And at that moment, Sophie can use the digital identity which is created on blockchain to do every transaction in which she needs her public Belgian identity. So to wrap up, this is the process. Sophie downloads the app, she registers in the app, and a public identity is created, and that is created on the blockchain. That's what you see at the bottom here. I think this one, yeah. That's what you see at the bottom here. Yeah? And then in the next step, here you can see multiple different identities, like the Belgian ID. This is actually a loyalty card built by the City of Antwerp, which you can use in stores, but also It's Me, which is an identity solution by the Belgian banks. And all of those identities are stored in blockchain. After that, Sophie asks to put them on the blockchain, and the government or the identity provider actually certifies that that is Sophie. In other words, the role of the government or of banks, in this case, changes. It changes from being a certification authority and an information provider to a certification authority and a facilitator. Now it is up to Sophie to give access to her information instead of the government. And we'll come back to that as well later on in the example. Now, Sophie is known with her public identity on blockchain, and Sophie is pregnant. So she goes to the doctor, the gynecologist, and it's the first time that she goes there. So again, how can that doctor prove that she's actually a certified gynecologist? We found a news article in which a doctor has been teaching for 15 years nurses, while that person didn't have a degree as a doctor. Just a photoshopped version on the wall doesn't prove that you're a doctor. It is a certification by the government again. So let me show you how it works. So Sophie enters at the doctor, and here you can see the doctor, and also the doctor has the app installed on her mobile, so she has registered like Sophie did, but she also registered her official doctor certification, and that was approved by the Belgian authorities called the RISEF, and in that way, Sophie can see that that doctor is certified. So what happens here is the doctor actually scans the QR code of Sophie, which is her public identity, and then Sophie will get a pop-up in which is indicated Dr. blah, 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 with that certification, wants to access this and this information. Now, Sophie can actually change what information is visible to that doctor. In this case, that's called Selective Disclosure. And in this case, Sophie will give access to, for example, personal information, medical information, and also the doctor will be able to create or modify medical information for Sophie. Yeah? This is what the doctor sees. When Sophie approves, the doctor gets an immediate pop-up. This is the information that you can see, and that is available for you. So, maybe to wrap up, here has been a trusted exchange of information and consolidation, reconciliation of information between at least 2 parties and possible 3 or 4 parties. The doctor, Sophie, the government, and potentially a hospital as well. Imagine how many databases and transactions would be in there, and how many administration even. We haven't seen a single document, we haven't seen a single file which has been exchanged. Now, here you can see the process again. So, again, the doctor also created her identity, so she registered her certification as doctor here on the blockchain, and all of that information is available on blockchain. Now, here you can see when Sophie actually does an exchange with the doctor. So, when Sophie approves that the doctor has information, that information is stored on the blockchain, so that Dr. Else, in this case, is allowed to view the information of Sophie, and it is available on blockchain. So next time, that information will be available unless Sophie actually decides that she's changing doctors, and that doctor is no longer allowed to access that information. Now, I promised you to go back to the smart contract as well. Imagine what additional services you can build on top of this. For example, recognizing the official father, or asking for child money, maybe finding child support, whatever. All of those kind of things, you can actually start automating them based on this flow. And that is what is happening in the next step. So, here you can Sophie, and she's actually pregnant, and Sophie and her husband are actually sitting next to each other. But to have the official recognition of the father in Belgium, you need to go to the municipality, and they will actually ask you to fill out a number of documents which you need to sign by 2 parties, etc., etc. Here you can see that the process is much more easy. In addition to this, here you can also start asking for additional steps in the whole process. Also, what we build in here is also a proposition of the last name of the child. Because there is a very complex law now in place in Belgium in which you can actually decide what would be the last name of that person. So again, the flow, where of course you have Sophie, sorry. So we have Sophie here, and the doctor who actually says that Sophie is pregnant, information is stored on blockchain, and then Sophie shares that information with her husband, Hamza. He approves, stored on the blockchain. And then Sophie actually shares that information with potentially her employer, etc., etc., other parties. Yeah? Okay, so one big happy family, of course. And in addition to how Sophie's identity was created on the blockchain, actually, in this case, Sophie delivered, which you can see here. And the baby is already born, so we had a virtual baby in 10 minutes, 9 months. And the baby is born, and the doctor actually indicates Sophie delivered a baby. The doctor is a certified authority, so everybody in the ecosystem will accept it. And the information, the identity of the child will immediately be created on the blockchain. So there is no more need for that child to register an app or whatever, and it will also be assigned to Sophie as being the mother. Now, they just had a child, they were living in a very small apartment. So the point is that the apartment is getting a little bit too small. In Belgium, we still have a law that if you move, a police officer needs to come by. So how the process typically works is you need to go to the municipality again, you need to submit a request for change of address. Then there is the local police officer, he will call you, he will visit you like typically 3 times because you're never home, because we are all working. and then he needs to check whether you have the basics in the house to be living there. And only then your address is officially moved, which is, again, a huge administrative process, meaning that in this case here, how we can do that, we are leveraging smart contracts again. While thinking with the client, what we did is we found two other possibilities. First of all, we still use the police officer, traditional process. The second one is having your neighbors upvoting you, having like 10, 20 neighbors close by, scanning your QR code, telling, yes, that person is actually living there. Or why don't you store the GPS location on blockchain? Because if Sophie is not sharing the information with anybody, nobody can access the information. Then you put on top a smart contract which actually identifies within the last 2 weeks, Sophie has been spending like 70% of the time at that location, so probably she's living there. And that's what you see in the last part of this video. So the moving boxes are going up and down. And what actually is the case in this video, and that's very important as well, because Sophie gave access to Dr. Else, but also to, for example, utilities companies or to the government or whatever, everybody will immediately be informed of the address change. So all the systems will immediately be updated. So no longer need to go to your utilities or your internet provider to update your address information. Here you can see the example to select what type of confirmation you would like to have. This is a very nice example of one of the major advantages of blockchain and smart contracts from our perspective. We do not believe to rebuild an existing process and a new technology. We believe to build an existing process and leverage additional services that are provided by the technology which is behind it. And that is actually what you can see here. When we started this proof of concept, we were not able to tell that there would be an issue with the confirmation of your new address. But when we were discussing with the city hall and with the people of the municipalities, they actually came up, this is a huge administrative burden, so can we do anything about it? So here you can see the end-to-end process. Now, concluding, basically what happened is, starting off, having information about somebody which is spread over different systems and nobody knows what's happening with it, if the information is still correct. In this case, Sophie, or the citizen, is actually at the center of the solution. And within the regulations, Sophie actually determines who has access to what information and when. And that's what we call a self-managed identity. We do not use the terminology self-sovereign because that is way off charts. It's a self-managed identity. You still have a regulatory framework in which this needs to work. So that is one of the challenges. But Sophie is at the center of the processes in this case. In other words, we are treating our citizens no longer as citizens, but as real people. And that is one of the things which is really, really, really important. Also, one of the final things that I want to give you as a learning is that when you build a blockchain solution, it is very important that you also build the experience and the services on top of it. A blockchain solution in essence, or a distributed ledger solution in essence, it is a database. The end consumer, the end user, the citizen should not see that there's a blockchain behind it. It is the services, the experience that you build on top of it that make the difference, and they should leverage the capital of the new technology of blockchain and distributed ledger. So this is what I wanted to show you. What questions do you have from the audience?
Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, hello. My name is Ilya, and I have a couple of questions actually. The first one being, if the actual legal procedure changes, how do you update your smart contract?
The question is, if a legal procedure updates, how do you update a smart contract? The point is, most of the procedures that we have in place at this moment are very solid. Some of them already originate from the time of Napoleon, to give you an idea. Yeah? And in this case as well, I think the legal framework with acceptance of GDPR and all those type of things that are coming up is pretty rigid. It is specifically when you build on top new services, like for example, I gave you the example of moving. If you want to use the new services like the environment upvoting you or the GPS location, that needs a regulatory update because that is not legislation at this moment. So question is, how do you need to work? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges. Does the technology need to follow the regulation, or does the regulation need to enable the technology? And if you take a look at what happened, for example, with Uber, we used, everybody once in a while uses Uber, and while in some countries it's not in legislation, and there has been fights, but in the end, legislation is changing in most of the countries. So it's a typical discussion.
Yeah. Okay, and maybe one more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. How do you deal with lost identities?
With closed identities?
Lost identities, lost digital identity, like for example, Lucy from your example, or anybody else just lost its private key.
Lost. Okay, sorry. So in this case, because we explicitly discussed this use case with the government, the government has an additional right to have or give you access again to your identity. So you have different stakeholders in your ecosystem, and that is what I meant, like the role of the government is changing. The role of the government is no longer the information provisioning, but facilitation and certification. And facilitation is emphasizing the network and supporting the network, setting up the network, the governments around it, but also if there is something wrong, to support that citizen to be able to access his or her identity again. And that is not a reoccurring process, that is an exception process. And that is what I mean by treat our citizens as people, not as citizens. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last short question.
Yeah, just very quickly, who actually owns the blockchain though in this case? Because it seems it's not actually the citizen in control of that data, it's the technology company that is managing the blockchain. So for example, if you as a technology company don't give me a button to delete my data, then I'm not in control of it. So it's you who's kind of in control of that.
So the point here is, again, there is regulation on this as well. So for example, you cannot withdraw access for the government for specific information because legislation says that the government needs to have access to basic information. To answer the first question is, this network is actually, the proof of concept has been initiated by the government, but they want to participate with hospitals, maybe with employer organizations, also with banks, and actually that is the next step in the pilot to see how can this be, how can this grow. So how this has been set up now is that you have different governmental agencies within the City of Antwerp, and each of them owns a node. And in that way, they're exchanging information. The point is they want to grow that into a bigger ecosystem, depending on the types of users that will start using this system. And that is always, and from our perspective, because being a global corporate, we don't see, from our perspective, our clients investing a lot in public blockchains. We see them mostly investing in private or in consortium blockchains. From that perspective, this is also one of the examples in which the governance and setting up the governance is always a challenge. So who's going to do the first step? Who's going to determine the structure of the network? And how are we going to extend that network over time? And how are we going to build the traction in the market? Or how are we going to ensure that our blockchain network or the solutions that we bring into the market are going to be the standard in our market and building an ecosystem in that way? How do we convince traditional players to participate in this type of an ecosystem? And that is one of the challenges, and that's not a technical challenge. That is, again, connecting the virtual world and the physical world to each other.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom, so much for this wonderful case study.